Undead duo, Edna and Craig's fight for survival against a zombie horde. Craig had always been fascinated by horror stories, loved the suspense they created, the feeling of twisting dread that grew more and more oppressive with each passing paragraph. He'd devour book after book, horror films flickering in the background, his heart racing as he followed the characters into the belly of the beast. But he'd never imagined that he'd find himself in the middle of a horror story himself. It started slowly, ambiguity creeping into his life like a mist. First, it was just small things, like missing keys or forgotten appointments. It was easy to chalk it up to his own forgetfulness, or the stress that came with starting a new job. But then the incident started escalating. He'd hear whispers in the dark, voices that echoed down empty hallways. Shapes would move just at the edge of his vision. He began sleeping less, always feeling watched. He was sure that he was losing his mind. It wasn't until he walked into his apartment one afternoon and found Edna waiting for him that he realized something far more sinister was going on. Edna was his neighbor, a quiet but kind woman who'd lived in the complex for years. However, what he saw before him defied explanation. Her skin was gray, her eyes were empty and lifeless, and blood was smeared across her lips. As he took a step back, she lunged at him, her arms open wide, and Craig stumbled away, his heart pounding in his chest. "Edna, what's going?" he began, his voice shaking, but she didn't seem to even hear him. Instead, she just kept coming, an unquenchable hunger in her eyes. Craig scrambled, realizing that there wasn't time to ask questions. His only goal was to get out alive. He backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on her, until he was out of the apartment, slamming the door shut behind him. As he stumbled down the stairs and out onto the street, barely able to catch his breath, he finally realized what was going on. Zombies. That was the only explanation for what he'd just witnessed. Visions of half-eaten faces, of broken teeth gnawing at flesh, of the undead rising up to stalk through the world, flashed in his mind. He'd always loved hearing about them, about the heroes and heroines who'd survived against all odds, but he'd never imagined it would become real. He spent the next few days barricading his apartment, stocking up on food and water, gathering up anything he could use as a weapon. His phone buzzed with emergency notifications, warning him to stay inside, to avoid all contact with others. He was on his own. Days passed, and Craig settled into a grim routine of little sleep and constant vigilance. He hadn't seen any other zombies or survivors, but he could hear them moving outside from time to time, groans and shuffles echoing in the night. Sometimes, he'd hear a scream, a shriek of pain or terror that would make his blood run cold. Was anyone else out there, alive? He didn't know. Then, one night, there was a knock on his door. He paused, holding his breath. It was a sound he'd been dreading, one that he knew could spell his end. He held his makeshift spear tightly, ready to fight for his life, as he inched towards the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice quivering. "Craig?" The voice was familiar. It took him a moment to place it, but then he recognized it as the landlord. "It's me, Harry." "Open up." Craig hesitated, uncertain. What if it was an elaborate trap, designed to lure him into their clutches? But then he realized that the landlord had always been kind to him, and it would be foolish to turn away someone who might be able to help him. He carefully opened the door, peering out, his heart racing. Harry stood on the other side, his eyes wide with terror. "Craig, we need to get out of here. They're starting to break down the doors. Come with me." Craig glanced outside, and saw that Harry was right. There were several shapes moving in the distance, eerily silhouetted by the flickering streetlights. It was only a matter of time before they'd be swarmed, surrounded. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and grabbed his bag, heaving it over his shoulder. They crept out into the night, Harry leading the way, with Craig following nervously behind. Every sound made him jump, every shadow causing him to tremble. He knew that it was only a matter of moments before they'd be attacked. And then it happened. They were rounding a corner when a zombie lunged at them from the darkness, its skin bloated and putrid. Harry reacted quickly, taking it down with a blow to the head, but as they paused to catch their breath, more shapes began to emerge, closing in around them. Craig had never felt so afraid in his life. The ensuing battle was quick and brutal, with Craig and Harry fighting for their lives, their weapons clashing against the teeth and claws of their attackers. It was a nightmare come to life, a scene straight out of one of Craig's beloved horror stories. But this time, he wasn't just an observer, he was a participant. In the end, they emerged victorious, cutting down the last of the zombies with a fierce determination. But as they caught their breath and began to make their way back to safety, Craig couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to come. Harry turned to him, panting heavily. "We have to keep moving. There's no telling when they'll come again." And so they kept moving, as the night grew darker and the horrors more intense. One by one, they lost members of their small group, until it was just Harry and Craig, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding in their chests. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, they thought they'd made it. They'd survived the night. They were safe. And then Harry began to groan. Craig turned to him, fear clutching at his heart. "What's wrong?" Harry's eyes had changed, he could see it now. They were lifeless, unseeing, just like Edna's had been. Craig stumbled back, horrified, realizing too late that his teammate had been infected. He was going to have to kill him. With trembling hands, he raised his weapon, and Harry lurched for him, his mouth open wide. It was a moment that would haunt Craig for the rest of his life, the last sputtering vestiges of his humanity devoured in those terrible final moments. He'd thought he could fight the horror, thought that he'd be like those brave protagonists he'd read about, who always emerged victorious in the end. But now, surrounded by the living dead, he realized that he was just as helpless as the characters he'd always loved. Ultimately, it was just another horror story, with him as the main character, and a very final, very horrifying twist ending.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and tell us what you think in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe.